Welcome to the Liminality Podcast, research from between words, beyond displacement. Liminality is an anthropological concept introduced by Arnold van Gennep in The Rites of Passage in 1909 and later developed by Victor Turner. It refers to a quality of being in between two places or stages, on the verge of transitioning to something new, a state of between and betwixt, in which individuals are no longer in their previous state, but have not yet reached the next one. Liminality often involves uncertainty, ambiguity, and vulnerability, but it can also open space for creativity, resistance, transformation, and new possibilities. This series is developed by the Liminality Research Consortium with support from Refocus Media Lab. The podcast episodes are meant to share the findings from its research on gender, sexuality, and health through the lens of liminality in the context of forced displacement and in the current political, environmental, and financial environment. In this episode, we speak with the principal investigators about what it means to survive the liminality of forced displacement. The conversation explores the rationale behind the research, how it emerged, key findings, and their relevance in today's context. Joining me are Dr. Monica Onyengo, Clinical Associate Professor at Boston University School of Public Health, and Dr. Shireen Herdari, the Principal Investigator of the Liminality Research Consortium and Research Affiliate at the Geneva Graduate Institute in Switzerland. She also serves as Executive Director of GENDRO, an international associate promoting gender-responsive and inclusive research. Shireen, Monica, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
After my intro about liminality, I would like to ask you how the concept of liminality relates to forced displacement.
Thank you for that question. Liminality, as you know, it's usually a state of ambiguity and uncertainty. And when populations are displaced, most often times they are running away from violence or whatever it is they are running away from, and they don't know where they are going. And wherever they are going, they hope they are going to find refuge and they are going to find safety. Uncertainty comes in the sense that that's not their home and they don't know what's going to happen to them. And also the structural systems which have been put in place puts refugees in a very uncertain situation in the sense that it takes time for them to be recognized as refugees within the countries where they've run to for refuge. And hence the word liminality, because they're always living in a liminal state. And this can be for long durations of time, depending on where they've gone to. So this concept is very, very significant and is very applicable to populations who have been forcefully displaced around the world.
Absolutely. So how did the idea of this research came about? What was your idea for it? Why did you decide to create your consortium?
Yeah, this idea came about many years ago, around 2016, 2017, when Shireen and I worked on a special issue of a journal where Shireen was an editor, and she invited me to be a guest editor. And this special issue was around sexual and reproductive health and rights in humanitarian crises. And we were very surprised at the lack of literature which was coming in around sex work, because we knew sex work is very common among refugees or people who have been forcefully displaced, but it looked like nobody was really doing work around this phenomenon. At the same time, during that time, there was already talk within humanitarian crisis settings that populations who are displaced were getting involved in transactional sex, in sex work, but the humanitarian community had not acknowledged that this phenomenon was existing. So that was very surprising for us. But at the same time, it also coincided with the ongoing crisis among the Syrian population during the conflict which was going on at that time. They were moving into the neighboring countries. There was a lot of uncertainty around their move. And at the same time, the EU and Turkey agreement had been signed. There were stricter asylum policies which were being implemented, and these were really putting refugees in very precarious situations, hence potentiality of them getting involved into sex work. So what was surprising for us is there were so many topics around sexual and reproductive health and rights, but none of the humanitarian communities who are working in this field were acknowledging or even thinking around this phenomenon or how they can address populations who are involved in transactional sex. So that was the impetus of Shirin and I beginning to discuss around it, thinking about the concept, and also thinking about what we can do in terms of bringing this phenomenon into attention so that the humanitarian community can pick it up. And it is a very stigmatized topic, so that is why we really wanted to find a way of discussing it and just bringing it into the mainstream of humanitarian assistance.
Shireen, you were called out by Monica on that, on being one of the original initiators of the research. So what was your rationale? Monica already mentioned basically the lack of literature on the topic. So was this your academic need of going deep into a topic that was unresearched?
Absolutely. Both Monica and I have a background in sexual and reproductive health and HIV as well. And the concept of transactional sex as a practice of exchange of sexual services for money or goods or favors has been well studied in the public health context as a driver of HIV, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa. But when we started looking at the academic literature on transactional sex in the context of sexual and reproductive health to begin with, in the forced displacement and humanitarian settings, we realized very rapidly that, first of all, there was very limited data and evidence out there about this topic. Second of all, it was the limited research that was there, partly was primarily focusing on women, and primarily focusing from an extreme poverty and precarity and, again, socioeconomic lens within broader patriarchal society when there is gender dynamics, and also very much mixing issues related to sex work, sexual exploitation, and abuse, and even to some extent conflating these terms with trafficking. So we were suddenly confronted with a conflation of terms, a confusion in terms of a definition of transactional sex, and a lack of nuanced understanding of what it means and what are the spectrum of transactional sexual activities in forced displacement and humanitarian settings. What are the drivers, in addition to, again, those very obvious ones around socioeconomic, extreme socioeconomic precarity, but also what are the implications, in particular from a point of view of health, both sexual and reproductive health and mental health, where Monica and I were more kind of engaged in the past academically. So that really led us to develop this research, but wanting to bring a little bit more nuance around these issues, ensuring that we also include men and people of diverse sexual orientation and gender identities in addition to women, to have a greater understanding of how these transactional sexual practices are experienced across the groups, as well as trying to shift away from the very pure individual lens, but also really examining what are the structural factors that creates these zones of precarity that facilitates transactional sexual practices, and in that case also what are the health implications. But also coming a little bit around understanding the level of agency that also exists, trying to approach this from a very non-judgmental way that understand that obviously in the forced displacement where choices are limited and options are not many, people might engage in it because of, again, lack of choice, and there are obviously different degrees of exploitation available, but at the same time recognizing that people also have a lot of agency and might also navigate this system by choosing to engage in transactional sexual activities for, again, for any kind of meeting their basic needs or necessities.
With such a sensitive, delicate topic, how did you go about doing this research? And I'm specifically asking about your methodology. You probably have quite many challenges. If you could tell us more about those.
That's a very good discussion. I let Monica maybe start.
Yeah, I'll begin. We were very intentional about choosing the methodology to use in this research. And first, as you may have seen or read, we used qualitative methodology or qualitative approach. And we used a qualitative approach because, like we said earlier, there was no much research which had been done on this phenomenon in humanitarian context. And anytime as a researcher, when you are dealing with a topic which is really not known, you want to start qualitatively by talking to people so that you can be able to understand the phenomenon, understand whether it's really an issue within the communities you're working with, and really get an in-depth perspective of the communities you are working with. So to that end, we chose a number of qualitative methods. We started off by doing what we call formative research. Just Shirin and a student of ours went to the field. And formative research is just really talking to people and finding out, is this really an important issue? Do we really need to research on it or not? And indeed, we found that it's an important topic and it's happening and we really needed to research. Then we designed the qualitative study. We designed in-depth interviews, focus group discussions. We talked to key informants. And we also did anthropological observation. And we also did this number of different types of qualitative method to be able to triangulate data. And triangulation just means that you want to really be sure that whatever people are telling you about that phenomenon is true around it. So those are the methodologies we used. And when it came to data collection, we were also very intentional in terms of how we were going to collect the data. We were very sensitive that transactional sex is a very sensitive topic, so you don't want to go to the communities and ask them, are you involved in sex? So we really figured out a way of going around it, asking people what are the survival mechanisms with which people employ in this kind of environment in a situation where you don't have a lot of essential services, you don't have income, the essentials which people need. So we were really very intentional in going around it and talking to people indirectly so that they're able to tell us what the challenges they are going through their migration journey, when they arrive into the country, and how they live within those countries. And then maybe transactional sex will come in, and indeed it came in as one of the survival mechanisms which populations use. Another thing which we were very sensitive about is to remember that the term transactional sex is very stigmatized. So that is something we were very sensitive to, and it informed how we were framing the interviews and just framing it around challenges like I've mentioned and how refugees navigate those challenges. For example, we were asking them, do you know somebody who may have been involved in transactional sex? So that does not put them on the spot to talk about themselves, and then we don't add a lot of stigma. And also, in terms of the populations whom we were interviewing, we also realized that when it comes to transactional sex, people always imply women, but men and other minority sexual orientation individuals also get involved in transactional sex. So those were areas we were very sensitive about in terms of methodology and in terms of that we conducted research in Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, Greece, and Switzerland.
As Monica explained, that also led that we invited any refugees to express interest to participate in the research. The criteria was not whether they had a personal or experience of transactional sex or witnessed anybody, but just simply bringing any refugees who have been forcibly displaced and would be willing to participate, to also give us a little bit of a true reflection of the frequency and commonality of this practice.
We will go deeper into specific findings in the next episodes. Just to remind everybody, Liminality will have 4 separate episodes. But in this intro to your research, I would like you, Shireen and Monica, to tell us a little bit in general, what were your main findings in your research?
Yeah, I can start by mentioning the main finding. Obviously, we found that transactional sex was common. People talked about it differently, and their perceptions about it was different depending on who you are talking to. But what we came to realize is among the people we were interviewing, either they had experienced it or they had observed somebody who was taking part in it. So that was a very significant finding for us. And then another layer of finding, we realized that there were different patterns of transactional sex, and this also depended on who you are talking to and what their perceptions were on transactional sex. And in terms of patterns, we found that one of them was sex work. You know, some people intentionally, based on their circumstances, chose to get involved in sex work where they can be able to make some type of income. And this included men, women, and individuals of diverse sexual orientation. Another finding was transactional sexual encounters. For example, when people are moving around across the borders and maybe they're being guided by smugglers, they may get involved in transactional sex in the sense that they want to cross the border quickly or they want to cross the border safely. So those were that was one of the examples which we were given in terms of people who got involved in transactional sex. Another finding we found was intimate transactional relationships, where people feel because of security, they can get intimate with somebody and have transactional sexual relationships. And this also could be for security, it could be for income, it could be for something somebody is looking to getting within the context when they are migrating or when they have already reached their country of refuge. They get involved into intimate transactional relationships so that they feel relatively safe that way, but it's very temporary. Another fourth finding which we found was temporary or convenience marriages. This is also something which was happening within this context in the sense that people get married temporarily to be able to overcome whatever it is they were going through under those circumstances for a short time, and then later on they can be able to annul those marriages. So those are the main 4 themes of findings we found out. We can go into details about them later, but those were what they were.
Just to add a little bit about as well from a methodological point of view, for us to be able to capture all these different categories and typologies, we had a working definition of transactional sex in the research that we use without using the term explicitly, but we agreed to use transactional sex as an umbrella term that really covers a spectrum of activities or practices where adults engage in sexual activities with the implicit or explicit intention of exchanging material or non-material benefits such as money, gifts, goods, services, favors, or any other necessities. And again, that definition also extended to temporary marriages, marriages of convenience, or relationships that were entered with the expectations of obtaining some kind of a benefit. Would it be a protection or accommodation or housing or any other thing? So that would allow us to cover a range of activities that might not be perceived as transactional sex, but it would fall under that umbrella term.
Shireen, if I may interrupt you, you mentioned in your definition that it's about grown-up people. Does it mean that you did not cover minors or unaccompanied minors? We know that transactional sex is happening in this group as well.
Yes, but by definition, any such practices with minors is a form of sexual exploitation. So that for us was very clear cut. That did not mean that such experiences didn't come up. We did interview young adults above the age of 18 who had migrated or were forcibly displaced as a minor and had experience of transactional sex or obviously sexual exploitation when they were minors. So that kind of a data was collected, but we did not necessarily interview minors because, again, the definition of such practices under the age of 18 is by default sexual exploitation.
Thank you for clarifying this, and I think it's very important to make sure that people understand this difference. I'm going to go back to my question about the relevance of liminality in the current global context, especially of displaced people.
It is absolutely very, very relevant. We know that there has been a wave of anti-gender, anti-refugee, anti-LGBT narratives and discourse stemming from a lot of, again, ideologies and political shifts around the world, including in the Western countries. And also at the same time, in parallel, huge funding cuts to the global health, humanitarian settings, ongoing wars and conflicts that has resulted in countries and states shifting their priorities to defense and military investments instead of development and humanitarian aid. And all of those obviously creates an extended and protracted liminality for refugees. First of all, you will have a growing number of people being displaced, both because of ongoing conflicts, as well as, again, growing risk of environmental disasters, and again, financial kind of precarities and marginalization, as well as persecution based on sexual orientation and gender identities and all of those aspects. While at the same time, a lot of the Western countries, a lot of the countries overall are being more and more restrictive with regard to migration policies, receiving asylum, and even those that they make it into various countries, including European countries or Western countries, are often ended up in a very precarious situation, often during a very long time, stuck in a situation when they don't have a right to work. They're not provided with all the necessities that they need, so they end up in that situation. So the risk of both being coerced into transactional sexual relationships or activities or practices, being exploited, and also choose to engage because of making a livelihood or survive will drastically increase. So we're kind of concerned that this topic will be unfortunately more relevant than before. And want to also add, among the larger findings across the countries, they were very clear that there were structural drivers of transactional sex, often lack of safe migration routes, again, inhuman asylum procedures, lack and limited availability of humanitarian assistance, again, the lack of right to have a job and have a legal employment, in addition to a number of other factors that I'm sure our colleagues from the different countries will dive deeper into.
Absolutely. Monica, Shireen, thank you very much for shedding some light on your research. And as they said, we will go deeper into the country-specific context in the next episode. We will also hear some quotes from the interviews to bring you closer to the protagonists of this research. We will learn about different structural aspects and how certain countries' contexts might shape different options for the interviewees. Make sure to check the next episode. This series is developed by the Liminality Research Consortium with support from Refocus Media Labs.